I would like to talk today about the evolution of the research I have been doing using soil moisture sensors for irrigation control. It's basically the highlights of the last 10 years of what I have done and where I think this is going to move in the future. But let's start off with a little bit background. Why am I interested in water to begin with? Most of the Earth is covered with water. And when you look at the total amount of water that we have on Earth, it is really a very large amount of water, but unfortunately only 2.5% of all the water on Earth is actually fresh water, the water that we use in our daily lives for drinking water, everything around the house, and to grow the crops that we eat. So there is still a large amount of fresh water available, but most of the fresh water on Earth is actually trapped in glaciers and the North and South Pole. So even when you look at fresh water, only 0.5% of all of the fresh water on Earth is actually available for use by us. So the amount of water that we actually have access to is a tiny fraction from all the water on Earth. So when you look at what has been happening with regard to water use around the world, it has been increasing exponentially over the last century. And agriculture is a big part of that water use. On average around the world, 60% of all the water that we use is being used for agriculture, for irrigation. So the human population is going to keep increasing, and what we need to do is make sure that we use the water as efficiently as we possibly can so that we can maximize production of agricultural crops. When you look at water use in different places around the world, it is probably not a big surprise to most people that in the US we use more water than almost anywhere else in the world. Actually, when you compare all of these countries, the US is using per capita more water than any other country in the world. So what that does mean in my mind is that there is a lot of room for improvement. So that is something that I'm very interested in. What can we do to make sure that we use our limited water resources as efficiently as possible? So to give you an idea of the use of water for irrigation in the US, this graphic on the right-hand side of the screen indicates where we use water in the US. And most water is used for power generation, but that is water that actually isn't used up. That water is taken generally from rivers and released back in rivers. When you look higher up, you see that irrigation accounts here for 34% of total water use, and that is what I call consumptive use. That is water that is being used up by agriculture that we cannot use for anything else. When you look at this, if we want to make water go further, we have to focus on irrigation. When you look at irrigation, according to the USGS, much of the water that is used, 40% of total water use in the US, is being used for irrigation. For irrigation, water use can come either from water that is extracted from surface waters, rivers and lakes. About 31% of all the surface water that we use is being used for irrigation, or we can pump water from the ground. And almost 70%, about 2/3 of all of the water that is being pumped from the ground is being used for irrigation. And in many parts of the US, we are pumping water out of the ground faster than that the groundwater is getting recharged through rainfall. And what that means is that our aquifers are starting to dry up. This is simply not a sustainable approach, and we cannot keep doing this. But when we talk about water, it is not just the quantity that matters. Irrigation is closely tied to water quality as well, because anytime that you apply more irrigation water, then you get leaching or runoff of that excess water that is not needed by the crop that you're growing. And in many cases, that water that may be running off or leaching contains fertilizer, pesticides, and it can create environmental issues. So water quality is an important concern as well, and we cannot forget about that when we talk about irrigation. To give you an example of what can happen with regard to water quality, this is a nice neighborhood, I believe in Ohio, And this is what this lake looked like at one point in time. But because of fertilizer runoff into this lake, what this neighborhood turned into was from this going to this. And you can imagine that this has a great impact just on the value of the homes, the quality of life. This obviously is not a very pleasant situation, and it probably doesn't smell very good either. So this is the kind of thing that we need to try to prevent by reducing the amount of nutrients that end up in our water sources. So what I'm focused on is improving irrigation management. And this is part of a bigger project where we try to provide real-time information to growers about the weather conditions on their farm, about how much water their crop needs, to help them schedule irrigation applications based on the actual amount of water that is needed by the crops that are growing. So this is the overall goal, and I need to point out this isn't just me. This is a big national program with multiple universities and several companies involved. We focus on greenhouses and nurseries because we feel that we have the biggest challenge and the biggest opportunity there. These are very intensive agricultural production systems with very high fertilizer and water use, and we grow these plants often in containers where you have a small amount of substrate or soil that is being explored by the roots, and it makes routine irrigation absolutely necessary. As a result, there are potential problems with getting leaching and runoff of water and nutrients from these sites. So this is our goal, but ultimately the kind of approach that we are developing is going to be applicable to any kind of irrigation system. So the objectives, the grand scale objectives of this project are to first of all develop wireless sensor networks. That is the hardware part of the project. Then there needs to be a software component to help growers use the hardware. We are working on developing guidelines to help growers make decisions about how they want to irrigate their crops, and we want to look at the socio-economic impact. What is the value of what we are doing to a greenhouse, to a nursery, but also to society at large? And so, to just explain to you what a wireless sensor network actually is, let's say that this diagram here is representing a farm. What you can do throughout your farm is place multiple little boxes which we refer to as nodes. So these white things are nodes that make up the wireless network system, and each node can have multiple sensors connect to it. In addition, we can connect an irrigation valve to some of the prototype nodes that we have now developed that can turn irrigation on and off automatically depending on the needs of the crop. That node is sending the data that are being collected wirelessly to a computer that you have somewhere nearby. And this computer essentially is the interface for the grower to control what the nodes are doing. So this is where the software is running, and growers can set up how they want to schedule irrigation, how they want to treat different parts of their farm. If they want to, they can use crop models to predict water use and irrigate according to those models. But what we can also do is put that information online so that you can access the information from your wireless sensor network through a browser no matter where in the world you actually are. So that means you always have access to the irrigation information, and you can make changes as needed without having to be present on site. So this picture on the left indicates what one of our prototype nodes looks like. It's actually very similar to the EM50 nodes that are being sold by Decagon. It has been modified to be able to control irrigation valves. And then on the right side here, you can see some of the soil moisture sensors that you can interface with that node. The inside of the node contains 5 AA batteries. They can keep this node powered for at least several months, sometimes up to a year. At the bottom here you can see how you connect sensors to this node. It is very easy. You just plug them in and the sensors will work. You can configure the setup later on through the software. On the right-hand side of this node, this is where the irrigation valve gets connected that allows this node to actually turn irrigation on and off. This is the other end of the system. The picture on the left here shows what we call the base station. This is the little radio that is actually communicating with all of the different nodes that you have in your network, and that base station then sends all of that information to a laptop or other computer that can then be used as the user interface. So that gives you an idea of what these wireless networks look like. The idea behind the irrigation control that we are using in my research is very, very simple. You put a soil moisture sensor in a container. It is going to send a signal to the node, and when a low substrate water content is detected, basically when that pot is dry, the node can make the decision that the crop needs water, and it can then activate that solenoid valve, and the plant is going to get irrigated based on the actual water requirements of that particular plant. So this can be fully automated. What I want to do now is give you some of the history of how we ended up where we are now. We started much of this research in collaboration with a large nursery in Deering, Georgia, McCorkle Nurseries. And here you can see some of the pictures from the nursery. The greenhouse that you see on the right-hand side is the greenhouse where we have done most of our research. It is a 2-acre greenhouse. So this is just an aerial view of the same facility. The greenhouse that we work on is the white rectangle in the lower left corner. So with our initial work that we did there, we were working with hydrangeas, and we controlled irrigation of this crop using the soil moisture sensor that you see inserted into the substrate here. That sensor is connected to this irrigation controller that you see on the right-hand side, and by simply turning that dial, you can have the irrigation come on or off when the substrate is wetter or drier, so you can adjust the set point for irrigation fairly easily. What we wanted to do was see how much water can we save by only watering these plants as needed using the soil moisture sensor, and we compared that to their standard irrigation practices. And just to show you the data from the very first 10 days of that study, the red line in this graph shows the amount of water that the nursery was applying to this crop, while the multiple black lines show the different crops that we were controlling using the soil moisture sensor. And what we were seeing within one day is that we were applying a lot less water than the nursery did. So it was clear very quickly that we could save quite a bit of water. But then there was the funny thing, when you look at the line for the different control plots, there are 2 days where the line is flat right in the middle of this period where this crop did not get watered. And it took us a while to figure out why would they not have irrigated for 2 days in a row, and the answer did not become obvious until I looked at a calendar, and it turned out that May 17 and 18 were a Saturday and Sunday. It was a weekend, and whomever was in charge of irrigating that crop simply did not come in on the weekend, and the irrigation never got turned on. The nice thing about automating irrigation using sensors is that they don't take weekends off, and they irrigate whenever the plants actually need it. So this was an interesting difference that we saw very quickly. So at the end of the study, we compared the water use between the control plots that were being irrigated by the nursery and the plots that we controlled using the moisture click sensor and controller, and it turned out that we used 83% less water than the standard nursery practices. So tremendous water savings. What we also saw was that the electrical conductivity in the substrate, which is a measure of the amount of fertilizer that is present, was lower in the control plants than in the plants that we were irrigating using the sensor. What that means is that in the control plants, they were leaching out much of the fertilizer that they had applied, meaning that it is not available to the plants, and it is going to end up somewhere in the environment. Of course, the bottom line is, can you actually grow plants this way? And what we found was that plant growth was very similar regardless of how these plants were irrigated. So we could grow these plants to the same quality with 1/7 roughly of the amount of water that they had been using in this nursery traditionally. So that was very promising. So 2 years ago we started a study in the same nursery using gardenia. Gardenia, and especially the cultivar radicans, is a crop that they have a lot of problems with. This crop is very susceptible to root diseases, which we think is generally caused by poor irrigation practices. So we wanted to see if we could grow this crop better, if we had better control of irrigation. So this just gives you an overview of the crop that we were working with. We were using the same controllers that we had in the hydrangea study, and we were controlling five groups of plants, and we asked the nursery to irrigate 5 similar groups of plants according to their standard irrigation practices. So this was one single block, so this is the number of plants that we were controlling using one of these controllers. So one single soil moisture sensor was actually determining when to irrigate all of these plants. So we came back later on to look at how much water we were able to save, and that's where our first big surprise came in. There were no water savings. Water use between our plots and the plots that the nursery was irrigated was within 0.5%, essentially identical. This really had us puzzled. We did not understand why we couldn't get any water savings. Well, with the hydrangeas it worked so well. But when we talked to the production manager at the facility, it turns out that they had actually asked their irrigation manager to mimic what we were doing with our soil moisture sensor. And it looks like their irrigation manager was very good at actually copying the irrigation that we were applying using the automated control, and he applied the exact same amount of water that we did. Interesting finding from this is that we can actually teach people how to irrigate better. Crop health was absolutely excellent. Not a single plant showed symptoms of disease. This was true in all plots, regardless of who was irrigating these plants. But this was a great finding because they typically may lose 20 to 30% of this crop to disease. So if we can grow this crop without any disease, that means that they have a lot more plants that they can sell. But what was really, really interesting is that we could really shorten the production time. Typically, it takes them on average 14 months to grow this crop. We were able to grow these plants in 8 months rather than 14 months. So a half-year shorter production cycle, meaning that they can sell their crop faster, they can put another crop into that same space. So regarding the finishing time and when they were able to sell these plants, the yellow bars here indicate when they were expecting to be selling these plants. That was their plan in advance. The white bars that you see is the time period during which they actually were selling these plants. So you can see that these plants did get sold much earlier than they had anticipated. So we wanted to look at the economic impact of this, and by shortening that production cycle, that reduced the production costs by about $7,700. So that is a significant amount of money. On top of that, because we did not have the problems with disease that they typically get, they ended up being able to sell 2,000 more plants than they thought they would be able to. So that also had a great economic impact. And taking a price of $6.50 per plant, that means that they got a total benefit out of this of almost $21,000, which is basically $1 per square foot in additional profit that they got by using better irrigation practices. So what this shows is that this kind of technique is not just beneficial from the perspective of saving water, it can actually have a tremendous economic impact on a nursery. This price does not include the opportunity of actually now being able to grow an additional crop in the space where you were producing this gardenia crop, where they thought they would have that crop for 14 months and sold it after 8 months instead. So the $1 per square foot is actually a very conservative estimate of the economic impact that we had there. So the last part of my talk, what I want to focus on is how can we implement this in the industry in the future. And to get that implementation, we have been working with Decagon devices on hardware development. Decagon has actually done the hardware development, we've been testing it. Carnegie Mellon has developed software to interface with that hardware. And then several different universities have been doing on-farm testing to see how well this kind of irrigation approach is actually going to work. So again, I want to focus on Niels Mill Farm at McCorkle Nursery. This is the same nursery facility. Now in the bottom right you see the 2-acre greenhouse where we are now controlling irrigation in that whole greenhouse using soil moisture sensors. And then there is a computer 300 meters away in an office that is collecting the data from all the different nodes that we have inside of that greenhouse. So again, here we have a picture of what that greenhouse looks like. We are now growing Loropetalums in this greenhouse, mainly. Inside of this greenhouse we have 8 NR5 nodes. NR5 nodes are the modified nodes that have the ability to control irrigation. These nodes are prototypes at this stage, not commercially available yet, but hopefully they will be in the future. We have connected 4 or 5 10HS sensors to each of these nodes. We are using a single EM50 logger, the commercially available node from Decagon, to collect weather data inside of this greenhouse. We measure light, temperature, and relative humidity. So this is a map of what the greenhouse actually looks like. The numbers that you see inside of the boxes are all the different irrigation valves that they have in this greenhouse. So they have a total of 54 different valves, and we are controlling these 54 different valves with 8 nodes inside of that greenhouse. The electrical work became a little bit tricky because one single node can actually only control up to 2 different solenoid valves. So we had to interface the node with a steady state relay, which then in turn was actually controlling the irrigation valves. But we did get it to work. So the black boxes that you see in this diagram are the different irrigation zones inside of this greenhouse. And this is a picture what it actually looks like. On the left you see that node there sitting above 2 irrigation valves. On the right side simply a picture of part of the greenhouse with the node and the irrigation valves in the background there. So the different colors here in this diagram indicate the amount of plants that are being irrigated using a single irrigation valve. So if everything works perfectly, then what the soil moisture content looks like is something like this. So the y-axis here is showing substrate water content as measured by 4 different 10HS sensors spread throughout that crop, and on the bottom we have the time. This is showing 1 week of data with the yellow background indicating daytime, the gray background indicating nighttime. And what you see is that the substrate water content is pretty stable over time. The different sensors are reading similar. And then you can see that all sensors are spiking up at the same time. That is a sign that that crop got irrigated automatically using the NR5 nodes that we have in place. I have to admit that things don't always look this pretty, but at times we are getting this level of control, which really allows us very precise water management. So it's always very, very promising and rewarding when we get this kind of data coming back from these nodes. We are also doing work at Evergreen Nursery, just outside of Athens, Georgia. So this is an aerial picture of that facility. This is a map. The blue rectangles on this map indicate parts of their facility where we are monitoring the substrate water content in that crop. Right now we are controlling irrigation in 2 parts of the facility. Those are indicated here using the red rectangles. And we have a single weather station, that's the little blue dot. So this is the software interface that we are using to communicate with these nodes, and the interface basically has a home page that shows a map of the facility and the different green, orange, yellow and red pictures that you see there. Those indicate the different location of the node, and the color is indicative of the water content measurements that we are getting from different parts of this nursery. So at Evergreen we have 4 NR5 nodes that are capable of controlling irrigation, and then 3 EM50 radio nodes that are only capable of measuring data and sending that to the computer, but not capable of actually controlling irrigation, turning irrigation on and off. All of the sensors that we are using here are EC5 soil moisture sensors, a little bit smaller than the 10HS sensors that we use at McCorkle's, and just like McCorkle's, the irrigation here is by overhead sprinklers. So this is a picture of what we're doing at Evergreen. The node that you see in the center of this picture is the NR5 node that is in control of irrigation for the euchera or coral bells that you see in this picture. One of the challenges that we have in this nursery is that they grow different crops that get planted at different types, all within the same irrigation zone. And when you have a situation like that, you have to be very careful in choosing which plants you want to monitor to actually turn irrigation on and off. And generally what we try to do is to find the highest water users, and those plants are going to be determining when the irrigation gets turned on or off. So this is the irrigation scheduling page. A little bit on the bottom half you see there a draw down menu to select a particular irrigation node. So right now we have selected node G6. Below that we can select which sensors we want to use for irrigation control. So in this case we have selected all of the 5 sensors that are connected to port 1 through 5. And then you see the low set point here set at 27%. That means that whenever the average of soil moisture sensor readings from these 5 different sensors drops below 27%, that is when the irrigation is going to come on, but only during the time periods that are actually shown at that bar at the very bottom. You can see in blue a time period highlighted from 9 a.m. till about 9:30 and from 3 p.m. till about 3:30. So the irrigation will only come on during that particular time period, no matter how dry the crop is. This helps the nursery to schedule all of the different irrigation procedures that they have to have throughout the entire nursery. So this is an example of data that we're getting from Evergreen, from this euchera crop. Again, good uniformity among the sensors. The red bars that you see in this diagram right here actually indicate when and for how long the crop got watered. So you can see the first irrigation was 15 minutes. 2 days later, the plants got watered for 10 minutes, and the irrigation controller will not irrigate on some days when the plants don't need water, and it can automatically adjust the duration of irrigation also based on how much water the plants have actually used. So this too seems to be working very, very nicely. So overall, the type of benefits that I think we can get from this approach to irrigation is that we can reduce water use. That is good for the environment, it is good for society, and it helps growers to save money. But what may be more beneficial for the environment is that we can actually greatly reduce the amount of leaching and runoff of nutrients and pesticides that would otherwise potentially get into the environment. So we can really have a big impact there. We also hypothesize that because we are leaching less water out of these pots, is that we can reduce the amount of fertilizer that growers need to apply. And fertilizer is very expensive. So this is large potential savings for the growers. We can give growers better control over plant growth and quality, including disease suppression. That too can be financially very, very beneficial. We have seen at McCorkle's that reducing disease pressure could have a major impact on the bottom line of that operation. So we're very excited to see that happen. But I don't think we will actually know what all the possible benefits are until we have more experience in different nurseries and growers start learning how to really use this technology. It's going to be very interesting to see how they are going to tweak all of the settings that they can control to really optimize the way that they are going to produce the crops. So we still have a lot left to learn in this project. I'm not going to list all of the people who have been instrumental in this research, but I would like to thank the United States Department of Agriculture for funding this project. You can see the various collaborators that we have in this work. And if you would like to get more information about what we're doing, please visit the website www.smartfarms.net, where you can read all about everything that we're doing. Thank you, and with that, I would like to take any questions you may have.